Prajajanaranjana Yasodanandana Prajajanaranjana Jamunatsira Vanachari Jamunatsira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we are continuing the chapter entitled King Yayati Regains His Youth, and the texts that we are reading today are text 26 and 27, so that's the 9th canto, the 18th chapter. And the verse on the board is text 27. Then I'll begin by reading 26. Vishaparvatam agnaya pratyanika vivakshitam gurum prasadayan murna padayo patita pati. And text 27, which we can chant together. Shanarta Manyur Bhagavan Shishyam Vyachasta Bhargava Kamosya Kriyatam Rajan Nainam Tyaktum Ihotsahe Shanarta Manyur Bhagavan Shishyam Vyachasta Bhargava Kamosya Kriyatam Rajan Nainam Tyaktum Ihotsahe Shanarta Manyur Bhagavan Shishyam Vyachasta Bhargava Kamosya Kriyatam Rajan Nainam Tyaktum Ihotsahe Please chant. Shanada Manyur Bhagavan Srishyam Vyachista Bhagavam Kamosya Kriyatam Rajan Nainam Tyaktum Mihotsahe Anada Manyur Bhagavan Shishyam Vachasta Bhargava Kamosya Kriyatam Rajan Ainam Tyaktam Mihotsahe. So I'll read the translation for text 26 before proceeding with the word for text 27. So the translation for text 26. King Rajasparva understood that Sukracharya was coming to chastise or curse him. Consequently, before Sukracharya came to his home, Vishaparva went out and fell down in the street at the feet of his guru and satisfied him, checking his wrath. And text 27, the word for word. Shana Arta, lasting only a few moments. Manu, whose anger. Bhagavan, the most powerful. Shishyam, unto his disciple. Vrishaparva. Vyachastam, said. Bhargava, Sukracharya, the descendant of Brigu. Kama, the desire. Ashya, of this Devayani. Kriyatam, please fulfill. Rajan, O king. Na, not. Enam, this girl. Jaktum, to give up. Aham, in this world. Utsahe, I'm able. So the translation for text 27. Vishaparva wisely thought that, the powerful Sukracharya was angry for a few moments, but upon being satisfied, he said to Vishaparva, my dear king, kindly fulfill the desire of Devayani, for she is my daughter, and in this world I cannot give her up or neglect her. Purport. Sometimes a great personality like Sukracharya cannot neglect sons and daughters, for sons and daughters are by nature dependent on their father, and the father has affection for them. Although Sukracharya knew that the quarrel between Devayani and Sharmishta was childish, as Devayani's father, he had to side with his daughter. He did not like to do this, but he was obliged to because of affection. He plainly admitted that although he should not have asked the king for mercy for his daughter, because of affection, he could not avoid doing so. Om Jnana Timrandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurin Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Shrimati Rama Padaswami Iti Namine. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschitya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha, Kripa Sindhubhyeva, Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha. So, looking at text 26, there's something to be examined, and that is the position of King Vishvaparva, since he's a disciple of Sukracharya. And if we examine his position, it's very revealing in that he, as a king, he goes out into the street and he falls at the feet of his spiritual master, Sukracharya. So just by virtue of the fact that King Vishvaparva had accepted the principle of accepting a spiritual master means that he's begun transcendental life. And of course, it's not clear whether he's attained devotional service, but if one considers the particular actions he's performing, it would indicate that the good qualities of knowledge have developed in somebody who's taken to transcendental life. So particularly if a person were to have taken to devotional service. So it can be said that, just generalizing, that all the good qualities of knowledge, meaning the knowledge of understanding the individual spirit soul in relation to the Supreme Soul, because that's what's considered knowledge, it rests on one element, and that is stated by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. And this is from a commentary that he's written on Bhagavad Gita. So he takes particularly out of the set of verses that where Krishna is speaking about the items of knowledge. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur particularly isolates the 11th, because it's 8 through 12, I think. He isolates the 11th verse, which is Mai Chanaya Yogena Bhaktir Avibicharini Vikta Desha Sevitam Arati Jana Samsadi. So it's the zealous engagement in this one element, this Avyabhicharini, meaning devotional service without a break, that is all good qualities rest on that one element. And this is according to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. So there's some good qualities that are revealed here by King Vishvaparva. And the particular good quality that he's revealing is a lack of ostentation. He actually went out into the street. So even in contemporary times, if one sees how the behavior is of the royal family, be it the British royal family or the royal family in Monaco, which are the only two that I'm sort of a little bit familiar with, one sees that it's very unlikely that the Queen or the Prince of Monaco just go out into the streets suddenly. It's most unlikely. Generally, there's a lot of arrangement made for the public to view from a distance the member of royalty, the prince or the queen. And if it is going out into the public, again, it's a very formal affair, very carefully monitored, carefully arranged. So here we find that King Vishvaparva, he actually showed this quality of a lack of ostentation because he merely went out into the street the minute he saw his spiritual master. And we also see that he's showing another interesting quality, and that's a kind of freedom from pride. because he was willing to satisfy his teacher, Sukracharya. And also another good quality shown is that willingness to worship his teacher, because he falls at the feet of his spiritual master. So he had in fact understood that Sukracharya was coming to chastise or to curse him. So he automatically was not expecting a good reception. He was, but out of respect, he performed, or his good qualities came out. So generally, one finds if one is not expecting a good reception from someone, one will avoid the person. So this was not the case with King Vishvaparva. And this not expecting a good reception from one's spiritual master is actually even considered a positive thing. And this is stated by Srila Baladev Vijayabhusan, because he takes the 8th section of those 8 through 12 verses from Bhagavad Gita in the 13th chapter, and he says, Aman itvam adambit ahimsa shantir ajavam amanitvam. So Srila Baladev Vijayabhusan, he actually defines this particular verse as not expecting a good reception is a positive quality on the part of a disciple with a spiritual master. So, you know, one can think, how does this work? So, there's King Vishvaparva, by his behavior, he was able to please his spiritual master. So he was able to actually check the wrath of Sukracharya. So Sukracharya was coming there with some feeling of wrath, but by the behavior of King Vishvaparva, by his good qualities, was able to check this wrath. And in response to that, how it is that not expecting a good reception from one's spiritual master on the part of the disciple is actually a good quality, according to Srila Baladev Vijayabhusan. Srila Prabhupada outlines a very similar kind of attitude that's very useful for making progress in one's spiritual life, in one's Krishna consciousness. He states that in rendering service to Lord Krishna and his representative, the spiritual master, one needs to always maintain this fearful attitude. Maintain a fearful attitude. Which means, because if one's maintaining a fearful attitude as a disciple towards a spiritual master, it means that one is going to give careful attention to what one is doing. So King Vishvaparva, although we don't know that he's actually performing devotional service, he's showing some of the good qualities that are listed as factors that assist one to progress in spiritual life. So now there are usually 20 factors used in gaining knowledge, according to Bhagavad Gita. And that knowledge that I'm referring to, that highest knowledge, is that knowledge of the existence of the soul in relation to the Supreme Soul, so the Jiva and the Paramatma. And of these particular factors that are used in gaining knowledge, or assist one in gaining knowledge, 18 are common to both devotees and the Gyanis. So even if King Vishvaparva had not yet come to the point of devotional service, I mean, we know he's taken to transcendental life, nevertheless, even if he was in a lower position, still those items of knowledge would be applicable, because according to Srila Prabhupada, these items of knowledge are common both to the devotees and the Gyanis, so those who are trying to reach the absolute truth through philosophical examination. So of relevance here is particularly that item of knowledge that is listed there, which is freedom from attachment to others. This is an item of knowledge. And another is the lack of identification with the condition of sons and others. These are two things that are listed. So it's relevant here, particularly in relation to Sukracharya. Because Sukracharya, he's exhibiting emotion in the presence of King Vishvaparva. He's exhibiting wrath and some anger. And these emotions are in relation to his daughter, Devayani. Devayani had told him, these were her words, how it's narrated, how she had been thrown into the well but was saved by the king. So this is what Sukracharya has heard. So you could say that Sukracharya is identifying his interests with those of his daughter. So indeed, it would appear that he's putting himself in her place and that he understands and shares her thoughts and feelings. So usually it's natural in any relationship that one empathizes with the person one has a relationship with. One tries to understand their thoughts or their feelings. And in this particular case, it appears that Sukracharya is even identifying his interests with the interests of his daughter. Because we hear he marches off to the king with his daughter. So it's not that he hears and proceeds with his life, but he actually really identifies with her thoughts and feelings. So this would indicate that the particular item of knowledge that I had just mentioned, that lack of identification with the condition of one's daughters or sons, hasn't manifested in Sukracharya. He's identifying with the condition of his daughter. So that item of knowledge doesn't appear to be fully there, doesn't appear. And so Sukracharya is then in the presence of the king, the father of the girl with whom his daughter had had a dispute. And King Vishvaparva, by his behavior, allows for Sukracharya to become pleased. And so he gives an explanation to King Vishvaparva of why he has actually, why he's performing this action of coming to him. And the explanation that he gives is that he's got an obligation due to the fact that he's in a parental relationship. So he sees there's some duty involved. And the obligation that he's explaining to the king, due to his parental relationship, is that he cannot neglect his daughter and he can't cast her aside, relinquish her. So this naturally seems very sensible. But then looking from the transcendental perspective, to be able to enter into the transcendental loving service of the Lord, performing parabhakti, one has to, or one can go through a process before coming to that point of just analyzing one's existence. And this analysis of one's existence is the process of becoming liberated. It's called Brahma Jigyasa, the search for the absolute truth. And this is something that one can contrast with spiritual life. When somebody's actually in a self-realized state, the Brahma Bhuta state. So there's a complete difference to just always working on analyzing one's existence compared to actually being factually liberated, because in a factually liberated state, there's a joyfulness and one's equally disposed to all living entities. So one isn't lamenting in any way or desiring anything. We get that explained in Bhagavad Gita in the 54th verse in the 18th chapter. So of course, it means that even if one is engaged in this kind of like analysis of one's life situation, one has to go further to become engaged in devotional service. So with Sukracharya, it would appear, I mean, I'm reflecting on this, it would appear that he's possibly not yet at that point of becoming engaged in pure devotional service. This Brahma-Bhuta stage, or the stage of actually being liberated, where, you know, it's like a springboard into devotional service after first having gone through all this analysis, philosophical analysis. You can contrast that with somebody who is actually engaged in devotional service. That person is considered to be liberated. So one's not working towards liberation and then coming to devotional service, but just by performing pure devotional service, one's already liberated. One's already in the state that allows for being joyful. So this is very interesting. And I guess I'm looking at this because of Sukracharya's staying with these emotions that are so much intertwined with those of his daughter, which somehow gives a sense of not being or not having developed those that kind of state or state of knowledge that allows for that kind of, I guess, detachment from his offspring. So now Sukracharya, he does this analysis of his existence. We see it, he's very good at analyzing. So he says, my dear king, kindly fulfill the desire of Devayani, for she is my daughter, and in this world I cannot give her up or neglect her. So Srila Prabhupada in the purport, he gives credence to this explanation, for indeed children are dependent on their father. Even a grown-up girl that's not yet married but about to be, still she's dependent on her father. And Srila Prabhupada points out that Sukracharya as the father was obliged to side with his daughter because he had that affection for his daughter. Now, Sukadev Goswami, when he's speaking to Maharaj Parikshit, so I'm going to a different section of the Bhagavatam because I want to highlight when transcendental life is not there, how the picture looks. So this is the description. I mean, I think it's very extraordinary. It's a description of some of the material miseries and troubles that disturb a conditioned soul in this material world, and particularly in that setting of relationships in the family atmosphere. So, so here's a description given by Sukadev Swami as he's speaking to Maharaj Parikshit. Sometimes the conditioned soul is separated from his father by death or other circumstances. Leaving him aside, he gradually becomes attached to others, such as his children. In this way, the conditioned soul is sometimes illusioned and afraid. Sometimes he cries loudly out of fear. Sometimes he's happy maintaining his family. And sometimes he's overjoyed and sings melodiously. In this way, he becomes entangled and forgets separation from the Supreme Personality of Godhead since time immemorial. Thus, he traverses the dangerous path of material existence and on this path he's not at all happy. Those who are self-realized simply take shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in order to get out of this dangerous material existence. Without accepting the path of devotional service, one cannot get out of the clutches of material existence. The conclusion is that no one can be happy in material life. One must take to Krishna consciousness. This is Sukadeva Goswami speaking. So it's an interesting, this is from the 5th canto in the 14th chapter. So this is an interesting description of being completely in the conditioned state. So one notices the emotions pulling one this way and that way, sometimes, being terribly joyful, feeling one's maintaining one's family, and other times, being very afraid and in some sort of illusion. And so the recommendation to take to devotional life. So indeed, this is an item of knowledge. Just having heard this, that item of knowledge, asakti, which is from 1310, so that whole chunk of verses there in the 10th one, 1310th, a lack of affection. Now this is interesting. This is the recommendation, a lack of affection for sons and other persons, since such affection is an obstacle for spiritual growth. This is how it's translated by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Asakti, so it's an item of knowledge to have lack of affection for sons and other persons, and such affection is an obstacle for spiritual growth. So this is this doesn't mean that one mustn't have feelings, for one's family members, but particularly it refers to not being attracted to those that are not favorable to spiritual progress. So, one may have family members, but to maintain that kind of attraction and allow one's emotions to go in all over the place, one's mind to be carried away, is actually an obstacle to spiritual growth. So the recommendation, it's an item of knowledge, is not to be attached to those members of the family. So I'll tell you from personal experience, I'll recount. When I go and visit my place of birth, I have an elderly mother and some relatives. And generally, when I visit, I spend a good amount of time, and now the person is deceased, but somebody that I felt a strong bond of affection with, who was a woman who was part of my life, but a friend of the family, and less time with my birth mother. In fact, I keep that quite limited. And, sometimes I would think about it, and one time, my spiritual master, I guess because I was very much preoccupied thinking about this fact that, I definitely could tell the amount of time spent with my mother. And my spiritual master was commenting that when he's in his travels, he's passing places where there's relatives. But it's not that he's going to visit those relatives because of the fact that they're not favorable to Krishna consciousness. So his recommendation in that moment in time was, that one puts one's affection, one puts one's attachment to devotees. So I've always followed that instruction ever since hearing it. So I happily pour out my heart with devotees, and it's a different thing with, my birth mother. I mean, it's limited, it's polite, it's thoughtful, it's, I do the necessary dutiful things, but my affection, my care, my attachment goes to devotees. It doesn't go in that direction. And so I was delighted to get that instruction from my spiritual master years ago, and So I find myself feeling very joyful all the time because I don't have to get into the distresses of thinking of the discrepancies in outlook or the discrepancies in habits. It's not of concern. So because attachment isn't put there, it makes things so much easier. So now, Srila Prabhupada, in this particular circumstance, he's pointing out that Sukracharya, out of his affection for his daughter, so it's attachment, you see, he was obliged to act in a way that he himself was plainly admitting was an action that he shouldn't have been performing. He's admitting it. He asked the king, "My dear king, kindly fulfill the desires of Devayani. For she's my daughter, and in this world I cannot give her up or neglect her." But he's admitting that, you know, it's because of his particular attachment, his particular connection to her, that he's having to make this request. Now, the items of knowledge that are specifically for Gyanis, so persons that are still moving towards liberation, they haven't yet come to that joyful point of being liberated from all these entanglements. And this is also listed in that verse in Bhagavad Gita 13, 8 through 12. The Gyanis, they accept the importance, an item of knowledge is to accept the importance of self-realization and the philosophical search for absolute truth. So this is specifically important for the Gyanis because their inquiry will lead them to liberation and thereafter devotional service. Now, self-realization for a bhakti yogi or somebody who's actually at the point of devotional service, that person just understands it as practical to search after self-realization. And Srila Prabhupada states that this is so because just through performing acts of devotion to the Supreme Lord, it necessitates that consideration of oneself as the spirit soul and one's relationship with the Supreme Soul. It's necessary to always examine. And this kind of examination that the Bhakti Yogi is doing, it leads to that kind of understanding always. I mean, whichever way you look at it, the understanding comes to the point of, I must serve. And one understands that one needs to serve eternally. Because by implication, one understands devotional service is also eternal. So, of course, this is contrasted with those who may not have it arisen in them yet, that understanding of service to the Supreme Soul. So there's many, many persons, and I'm looking at this just because of Sukracharya's position. It's kind of interesting. Now, if one's following this practice as a bhakti yogi of always serving, it brings one to a saintly position, and it also brings one to a position where one's friends with all living entities. It's not that one's actually distinguishing, this person's not my friend, this person's my friend. One can be a friend to all persons. Means that there's a peaceful consciousness. This kind of peaceful consciousness, it indicates that one is controlling one's senses and one's mind. And so liberation is just inbuilt. One's liberated if there's control of the mind and senses. So, and this is something that's expressed in the 5th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam in the 14th verse. So knowledge is the process by which Lord Krishna becomes known, and the opposite of this is that state which I guess we're seeing exhibited in this pastime, particularly perhaps by the daughter, and maybe a little bit by Sukracharya through his carrying wrath and anger. So the opposite to having this knowledge where one is striving always to understand that connection with the Supreme Soul is actually being in a state, and it's referred to as ananya, that state that's contrary to self-realization. And that state is being in a state of pridefulness, or being in a state of pretension, or being in a state of intolerance. And all those states that aren't directly connected to that exploration of self-realization are considered ignorance. This is how it's analyzed by Krishna. So an example of such ignorance, and this I'm going to draw again on, personal exposure, and particularly because I was reading in the 5th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, a most fascinating section called the Forest of Enjoyment. So an example of ignorance, say somebody's in some sort of prideful state. This emerges, and this is one of the things that was highlighted, and I had recent exposure to this. So it means somebody's fallen into a state of ignorance. So the minute, one is not looking to self-realization and putting emphasis there, and one falls into a prideful state or a pretentious state, or so an ignorant state, means that some of the natural conditioned defects start emerging. So one of the things that was listed in the 5th canto as an example of this kind of ignorance is transactions with money. So if a person falls into that ignorant state, particularly in transactions with money, then the defect that's naturally there in all persons, and it's a conditioned defect, meaning it's a kind of learned inbuilt one, is that of cheating. So the cheating emerges, and then persons become enemies. So this was brought up as an example of ignorance, and I had a recent exposure to this, watching it transpire. It means that a person becomes a victim of their material condition. So just the minute one moves away from self-realization and falls into ignorance and doesn't stay with those items of knowledge. So now, knowledge is fueled by a very important factor, and that is always remembering that the actual object of knowledge, anything one is trying to understand, always has to be something in connection to oneself as a soul in relation to the Supreme Soul, and that interrelationship. And this is again fueled by this avya-vicharini bhakti, or steady bhakti. Because by such a process, such as like we're doing, and I mean, of course, classes are good places for falling asleep, but if in this kind of situation, one's actually hearing with great concentration and serving the devotees, these are actually processes that allow for the steady bhakti to be manifesting. And this is again listed in that fantastic verse of Bhagavad Gita, the 13:8-12, and particularly the 10th verse. I'm going to read that one. Maya chananya yogena bhaktir avya vicharini vivikta desha sevita marati jana samsada. So these were some reflections on Sukracharya and his identifying with his daughter's interests, and it took me in the direction of the items of knowledge or factors of knowledge, and how that actually plays such a big role in being able to read behavior as to whether it's falling into the category of focus on self-realization or having fallen into ignorance. So I found this was something I was reflecting on, because just through recent dealings I had to look at such a question. And so always when I find myself in this position, I'm reflecting based on something that's transpiring, I guess, in my daily life. So I don't know if it was very clear, my communication, but at least it was purifying for me to explore this. So if there's any question to go deeper into this discussion.
Hi, Krishna. I'm wondering about the flip side, the other side of this detachment, unaffection from family. Seems like if you don't have a balanced approach to this, it can create a lot of difficulty on the other side of like rejecting family or becoming hard-hearted towards just people in general. I find that when if I were to reject my family, it would be, I feel like, unbeneficial for me as a person. So it seems like you have to, you can't have affection in the sense that it takes you away from devotional service, but to become like absolutely rejecting them, I also feel, unless you're on a high level of devotional service, is not beneficial. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that.
So, the reflection that was being shared was that on a personal level, it would lead to hard-heartedness were one to reject family members, and that it would seem that one would have to be on some advanced stage on the path of self-realization to actually be thinking of rejecting family members. So that was a reflection. Well, in dealing with any human being, one is dealing with the person, thinking of that person as a spirit soul, because one's on the path of self-realization. One is trying to assess the space in the relationship that allows for that spirit soul to awaken, in some sense, their own awareness of being a spirit soul. So the family situation may be one where there's, and generally it's the case, there's very strong bonds because of, particularly a child is dependent on the parents are affectionate towards the child, they have made sacrifices for the child to allow for education, maintenance. So there's a bond that's there, there's no doubt about it. When one takes to the path of self-realization, one reassesses the relationship, because one is now looking with the eyes of knowledge. So one is seeing individuals that are spirit souls. One has had a material relationship with those persons, But by virtue of the fact that they are parents, it means that there's obligation and duty. So all that was provided for one, there's a need to reciprocate in some way. And the way one reciprocates as a person who's practicing devotional life is to look where there are openings for that spirit soul to awaken their relationship with the Supreme Soul. So one is actually very active internally thinking about that. So there's no question of rejection, but the whole-scale attachment, because now one's reassessing the relationship, it may not be conducive to one's own spiritual life. One may fall into ignorance. And that's what one wants to spare oneself from. So how to find the fine balance of how one acts, how much one extends one's feelings, how much one doesn't extend one's feelings, how much one falls back on old known patterns of behavior or old known bonds of affection. One has to assess it carefully. It's like as one's going through the process of self-realization, at any moment one is very conscious of a particular facet in one's own devotional life that one's working on, or that one's examining, or one's refining some understanding. So intelligence comes of how one can be of assistance to those spirit souls that are one's family members. So like in Sukracharya's case, his idea of existence was to completely identify with the interests of his daughter. That's not the healthiest thing to do, because the interests of one's parents, may be covered by illusion of some kind, because after all, they're not making the distinction between body and soul. So as an intelligent, thoughtful person, one's going to be cautious about identifying with the interests of one's family. One's going to be very cautious. Rather, one stays in one's position of, servitor of Krishna, servitor of one's spiritual master, and then as something comes one's way, one looks at how to deal with the relationship from the angle of knowledge. So one doesn't fall into ignorance, because it's a mistake. I mean, it would be like a Jekyll and Hyde thing, that one's, devotee, and then suddenly one reverts to old habits and old way of being, and when one's with one's family, and then one goes back to, better habits and better whatever. I mean, that would be a Jekyll and Hyde thing. I mean, how can one actually function? It's one has to integrate. So that process of integration just means that one intelligently assesses and looks with the eyes of knowledge and is cautious. And where there's an opening, one gives encouragement. Perhaps it's a little change of habit. I mean, a person may not be philosophically inclined, but a person may be open to some change of habit, so one can even assist that way. But again, not living a Jekyll and Hyde existence. One comes as the person one is in the present time, and one proceeds with one's practices, and one looks kindly upon one's family members, but one doesn't identify with their interests. Otherwise, clearly, there's a discrepancy in one's life. So that way one doesn't fall into ignorance, just that not identifying with their interests. And that there is no harm in that, and that is not being a traitor to one's family. That's being intelligent and helpful, because then one can, still be of assistance. But if one slides into that kind of identifying with interests, one's in the same mire of ignorance. No good. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hare Krishna, thank you for your class, and thank you for the answer. It was a really good answer, and more or less, it pretty much answered my question. But you also, I'll try to expand on it. From some points I remember, maybe you could expand on that also a little bit. Like I said, pretty much I'm just repeating kind of the stuff you said, and you answered my question essentially when you answered Gita Diaries. I appreciated that answer. You were mentioning that Shukracharya's affection for his sons and daughters, you were mentioning that that was a commentary of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, that that was an obstacle, his affection. So that reminded me of a quote of Radha Maharaj that I really appreciated. The lecture is called Gratitude, the Womb for Humility. He says, when raising children, because in this pastime we see that she told her father, you know, Daddy, things are not going my way, fix it. Then, you know, she was happy. So then another circumstance, and Daddy, things are not going my way, fix it. And he was like, okay, daughter, fix it. So Radhanath Maharaj, he said a nice quote that reminds me of this pastime. He says, when raising, in that lecture, Gratitude, the Womb for Humility, you can look that up on YouTube. He says, when raising children, it's not good to spoil them, because when children are accustomed to getting whatever they want, whenever they want, when they grow up, they're gonna have the same mentality. But the problem is that when we grow up, we do not always get whatever we want, whenever we want. And so we see that Prabhupada mentions in this purport that she was childish, and it seems like it wasn't necessarily her fault. Her father was kind of maintaining her childish mentality, so she was always drowning in the ocean of material existence. So there's one other quote that I really appreciate in this regard that helps me maintain my peace of mind. It says, ships don't sink because of the water around them. Ships sink because of the water that gets in them. We can't stop everything on the outside: opposition, criticism, circumstances, rumors. But if we allow us on the outside to get in on the inside, then we'll sink into fear, depression, anger, vengeance. And so basically, like I said, you pretty much answered my question. Maybe you could expand on some of these points, because I don't want to give it away, but later in this pastime, I'll just tell you which verse that I marked a long time ago. That later in this is from Canto 9, chapter 19, verse 27 and 28. Basically, if you read that verse, it explains that Devyani's husband, what's his name? King Yayati? No, that's her father,
sorry,
right?
Yes.
King Yayati.
Yes.
He basically explains to her that associating with family members is like, it says it right here, it says it's like associating with tourists in a hotel. Associating with family members. And this is from the 9th canto, chapter 19, verse 27, 28. So basically, he essentially says the same thing. In order for us to, our consciousness to sail on a Krishna conscious cruise ship, we should be attached to Krishna. It doesn't mean we're impersonal with family, but naturally, if they're unfavorable and if they're very disrespectful, then why are you going to hang around people who wants to drag you down, like you said? So like I said, you answered my question, and it was a very inspirational answer that you gave, and I appreciate it. So if you'd like to expand on some of these points, I didn't really have a question, but I was just appreciating some of your answers. And so.
Yeah, Jai Baladev was reflecting too that you know, if one was in the presence of unfavorable family members, then you know, it wouldn't make sense to be spending a lot of time there, because it drags one down, and so one's Krishna consciousness is affected. And he was also looking at something of the relationship that you know, was discussed in this particular class of Sukracharya and his daughter Devyani. And so he was just observing that in some sense there was a kind of, out of affection, there was a kind of maintaining of the childishness of Devyani in terms of the father been asked to repair this problem or that problem and, just come and fix it, and so he would do so. So there was that reflection. So, yeah, and the question asked was there any thought to share on these reflections? I'm thinking if there's anything to add that's of relevance. Well, it can deplete one's spiritual strength if one's not in the association of like-minded persons. And the constant recommendation is to associate with devotees. And the reason for that is that one's spiritual strength is bolstered. And one also increases one's gratitude for being in the shelter of such exalted personalities. So that's just a comment on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of finding strength versus being dragged down. I mean, the level of joyfulness, the level of gratitude, the level of inspiration in spiritual life shoots up dramatically if one's in the company of wonderful devotees. I have this experience regularly, and it's so valuable that one couldn't look at any other situation and find any taste for it. It's very difficult. So I think that would be my comment. Thank you very much. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you for your very kind attention.